Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a year-round talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, theater, and entertainment. And today we are incredibly lucky to be joined by the fantastic Tweel, who's the director of Heaven's Gate, The Cult of Cults. And the first thing I wanted to ask was about the overall kind of arcing in terms of the narrative structure of this series, because it's a four-part series, but also within that, you're trying to cover a monumental amount of time. You're looking at over 2 decades that this group really existed and operated. So how did you begin structuring out narratively what that flow was going to look like in order to be able to capture all of the touch points that you wanted all along the way?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I make features as well, doc features, and I try to stick as closely as I can to, some semblance of a hero's journey. And when you're doing series and doing multi-parts and you have like ends of episodes and you have to not have a cliffhanger per se at the end of everyone, but it's the structure and the feel is different. So for me, I still try to focus on characters and be as character driven as possible. There's a lot of plot that needs to be gotten across, but we really were trying to arc the series out sort of by Frank and Sawyer. They're the emotional heart and core of this, and and they're the most insightful people that were around for the longest. And so based on the interviews that we did with them, the podcast that we based this on, the 10-part Stitcher podcast that Glenn Washington hosted, gave us a semblance of that as well. But we were really just trying to figure out what Frank and Sawyer's beats were, and then what other plot points around like what was happening in the cult laid out on top of that. I mean, we originally were trying to think of a way that we didn't have to do this chronologically, but the more we got into it, it just sort of fell into place and was simpler that way.
Yeah. And with Frank and Sawyer, who were both members of the group, I know that there were other members of the group that you reached out to that were a little hesitant about being involved, because this is a group that has been really maligned by the media. And you show that within the series. You show how it was the butt of a joke on SNL within a week of a mass suicide event. And so even in talking with the two of them, what were the types of conversations that you had and the way that you made them feel really safe and trusting of what you were going to create and how you were going to tell their story?
Well, I think in all the people that we talked to, it was trying to convince them to trust us in the sense that we were going to break down that narrative, that we were going to be different, that we were doing a deep dive, but B, really trying to get to know their perspective. And even it boiled down to my interview process with them. Most of the people that we interviewed for the show were some of the longest interviews I've ever done in my career. Sawyer was 7 hours long. Frank was like 5.5. I just wanted to give them the floor to be able to say all the things that they wanted to say, and then, use that in the edit as much as possible and make it as authentic as I could to what their viewpoints were, because there's differing ones. There's lots of differing ones between academics and former members and family members. So I wanted to give everyone their due, but really, at the core, break down what I think a lot of people have stuck in their minds about the Heaven's Gate cult, which is, it quickly became something to mock and to laugh at and like discard as, these crazy people that believe these crazy things about, UFOs and extraterrestrials coming down to beam them up. And it's deeper than that. It's more connected to, Christianity than people remember. And it's more connected to, being of the time and place of which the movement came out of.
Mm-hmm. And we see the trauma and the fallout that continues to this day for them. And, Frank still having a speech impediment that he developed whilst he was in the group as part of the traumatic experience at a certain point with one of the founders. Were you aware that was the emotional track that they were still currently on when you first started having conversations with them? Or was it something that you really discovered once you went into the interview process with each of them?
Well, I didn't know until right before we were going to go talk to Frank that he was actually in the process of going out on the road and trying to experience a sense of freedom that I don't think he's felt in a very long time. He's still very much traumatized by what happened to him and his experiences in the group. So that was just a moment of synchronicity. We were there for him packing up and really trying to have this big life change. So that he could, find some happiness and some freedom, which is a nice juxtaposition to Sawyer, who still believes in a lot of the group's teachings, and they could comment on each other, and so but I knew going into it that Sawyer was still a believer. That was something that was explored in the podcast, and was one of the things that drew me in to the project in the first place, because I really wanted to know, what was this guy's daily life like? What was his thought process just going through modern times, but believing this ideology that's that sort of almost he's one of the last surviving members of.
Yeah. And you really look not just at the ideology that people were drawn into, but the human connection and the emotional connection that this group provided and offered, and demystify that idea that there's only a certain subset of people that would ever buy into this, that actually there's a possibility that anybody could buy into it. And I heard that one of the questions that you actually asked a lot of participants in conversations was, what's the difference between religion and a cult? And that everybody gave you really different answers. So once you started to have that conversation and ask that question and see the myriad of responses that you were getting, how did that then sit in the back of your mind as you were making the series and thinking about the way that you wanted to convey this?
Well, that question, I mean, it was wild. I wanted to be able to try to find an answer to it. And really, for me, my experience of making the show was like, it's kind of an unanswerable question. It's a gray area, So a lot of the sociologists that we talk to will say, like, yes, there are cults. There are stipulations from which you can really delineate what the tenets of any cult is. The charismatic leader, retreating from society. There's a whole list of things. But then you talk to the religious studies professors and academics, and they say basically every religion is a cult. They all, the old adage is cult plus time equals religion. And so, and you talk to members, and all the people we talked to had different answers. So I didn't get a clear answer. And so I tried to mirror that, and that there's no definitive answer in the show either. I hope that the show makes the audience think about those things and think about, the sort of history and tenets of their own belief system, as a thought experiment. But really, some things are unanswerable.
And, beyond the archival footage that you have and the photographs, there's a lot of minute details, even down to the letters that one of the founders sent her daughter, and the rule book that they had as an organization, which, there's still people that have copies of that floating around. What was that journey of really discovering that you had access to those types of materials as well? Because a lot of those are things that people present to you in the interviews.
Yeah, I mean, we got lucky on a few instances. Frank in particular had a lot of old material. He had material that his family had collected that they had passed on to him while he was in the group, pamphlets of like anti-cult material, any sort of article over the course of his 18 years in Heaven's Gate that mentioned him or Erica, his girlfriend that he joined with. And so Frank was a great resource. But really, like, one of the most bizarre and just fortuitous things that happened to us was we had an editor who was reading some of Frank's cousins, who was also a member, Frank's cousins' letters back to his parents. And in 1976, he was like, I wish that you guys could have been at this meeting we had in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So just like the viewpoints were expressed so clearly, and there were some media members there that were filming it, and they really captured the essence of the group. And our editor read this like media member's name and like looked him up, just going down an internet rabbit hole, found that he still existed. We called the number. His son answered. His son was like, "Oh, my dad passed away, but I have all these tapes of this like public access show that my dad filmed in 1976." And so that gave us some more footage to really see in the moment what people were believing and where they were in their evolution, very early on, like a year in. And some of the people, it was wild to see that we saw them a year in, and then you could see where they were 20 years later.
Yeah. And particularly early on, the group moved around a lot, and there, very frequently local newspapers, if they knew that the group was there, because there was such a fascination from the media, would write stories and discuss them. Was there any sort of research journey that involved, okay, so they were in Houston at this point, so let's look at local newspapers from that time and dig through for stories and how they were covering it from their community perspective?
Yeah, I mean, between our editors and our archive producer, Derek Banner, I mean, we were driving him nuts because we were like, okay, we found that this like photo and it's from the National Enquirer in 1975 in San Francisco. Can you try to track down this photographer? But yeah, but between all the myriad of sources, one of the people that we really used was Robert Balch, who was a sociology professor who went sort of undercover and joined the group for about 3 or 4 months. He really did a great job throughout the whole 22-year existence of tracking where people were. And he had a document that, to the best of his knowledge, could track where the group was at any given time. So we had that, and we also found our own, clues that sort of amended his work.
Yeah. And there's also that period of time where many people thought that the group had disbanded and didn't exist because they went very underground for a certain period of time. Was there a difference in the research and the materials that you were able to uncover from that point, because they weren't being covered in the media in the same way at that point in the journey?
Yeah, I mean, that for us, that was an opportunity to sort of get into the evolution of the ideas of the group. And when they went into hiding, that's when things got stricter. And there was this, over the decade and a half or so, a shift in a lot of their perspectives. So for me, one of the things that attracted me to the project was a lot of the writings of Lawrence Wright. He did The Looming Tower and the Going Clear Scientology book. And those really detail, over the course of many decades, how a belief system can start out as somewhat benign and then change over time. And those years in hiding for Heaven's Gate were, I think, vitally important to that shift. One of the co-leader, Bonnie Lou Nettles, T, dies, and it really, rearranges Doe's thinking about the group and sort of like spurs his narcissism and ego even more, because he's the last one left. So I think that dark time period allowed us to explore the sort of religious tenets a little bit deeper.
It also causes such a shift in the tone, in the way that you're telling the story. At the beginning, it's like everybody just felt this idea of promise and possibility and what this all could be. And then, like you mentioned, after Bonnie's passing, that really shifted and changed the group dynamic and what it was. Did you find yourself actively thinking about the shift in the tone throughout the series from that point onwards, or did you find that the story just really drove what the tone was?
Yeah, I did want there to be a shift throughout. I think, it starts out a little more quirky, and I think that some of the members were quirky and wore that with a badge of honor, and would, had a sense of humor about the way that the public perceived them. So we wanted to play into that and acknowledge that. But certainly by the time you're getting into like the end of episode 2 into episode 3, there starts to be this real debate around how much the group members are being manipulated, whether they know it or not. Discussions of brainwashing, castration, things that it starts to go even more bizarre and even more dark. And then the final episode is sort of dark all the way through. I mean, one of the things I discussed with our composer, David Wingo, who is amazing, was trying to help mirror that shift in the music. But we also tried to not use any percussion throughout the entire score, because we wanted it to be somewhat like ethereal and floaty, and not ever be like ground, as he put it, like percussion grounds you. So we wanted to literally be in the heavens as much as possible and have that sort of like lightheartedness shift into darkness.
And with conveying Bonnie as a character in the series, you know, she wasn't as media savvy and putting herself out there as much as he was. There's less archival footage of her, and obviously she passed away partway through the journey of this group, so she wasn't around in the later years. So what was the journey of really capturing the essence of her without having very much of her voice available to really discover that side of her, and only hearing about her through other people's perspectives and stories?
Probably one of the hardest challenges of the show. I mean, I think that Bonnie Lou Nettles T, she called herself, was vitally important and also unique. Like, you don't see or hear of a lot of female cult leaders. So it was something that I wanted to try to really get into as much as I could, but having firsthand accounts of it, and, you know, trying to hear from her daughter and trying to hear from Frank and Sawyer are sort of like the only resources we had to really get the nitty gritty of her, because everyone else only, it's secondhand. And she was purposefully mute. She did not talk in public at all. We were able to get access to some of their recordings of their group meetings throughout the course of the 20 years. And so you heard her voice a little bit there. You hear her talking about Boy George in the series, which is kind of wild. But the truth is, like, trying to really understand her perspective and her journey was difficult. And sort of like her psychology of what made her be so attracted to New Age philosophies and UFOs. I think to bring up another sort of part of the presentation of the show was our animations were meant to help try to bring her to life as much as we could. That relationship between her and her daughter, who she left when she joined the group, I thought was pretty emotional in talking to her daughter. So I wanted to bring that to life as much as we could. And so the animations really helped portray their relationship.
One of the things that surprised me to learn about the group was the fact that there was always the freedom for members to be able to leave. And that's not the case with all of these types of organizations and groups that come together. You know, that's often a real element of control. But interestingly, that actually seems to be what caused people to keep being pulled back into it, and to create a magnetic field almost, where people would leave for a little bit but still feel drawn back, because it was like, well, they're giving me the freedom, they trust me, they believe me, and it was all part of the psychology as well. Was that something that you knew going in, and how did you view the way in which they created that freedom actually being a sense of control?
I mean, I was blown away by that. I did not know that at all. I mean, I had just a cursory knowledge of the group going in, from my own, like, I was in high school when the suicides happened in '97. So, you know, I knew the late night jokes and the CNN coverage at the time. That was it. But hearing that they were allowing people to go, what resonated for me was talking to one of our sociologists that we interviewed, Yanya Lalick. And she said that groups like this really are they only want what she calls true believers, people who are 100% dedicated. And so, you know, Heaven's Gate didn't have more than a few dozen members in it at any given time. So it's not like some of these other groups, NXIVM or Jonestown or Scientology, like, they're huge. But everyone that was there really wanted to be there. And they would have moments of, you know, oh, this is too hard. Our nomadic lifestyle, the strict diet and the rigidity is too much. And they would leave. And then a year later, they would come back, because ultimately they connected with the message of, like, the way in which their soul was going to be saved so much that that's all they cared about.
When you were going through a lot of that footage, particularly with some of their meetings or when they were out there recruiting and talking to other people, some of those videos were quite lengthy and were several hours long. So what were you looking for specifically and narratively as you were combing through them and really thinking about those really small snapshot moments that would convey the larger context of it all?
I mean, I sort of think about story in terms of setups and payoffs, you know? So it's almost like we're trying to reverse engineer, where did people's storylines end up, and then how do we backtrack and set that up to the most powerful effect as possible. So, you know, some of the members Dick Jocelyn. There's a lot of footage of him early on, and seeing just his like bright-eyed exuberance really is a great juxtaposition to his disillusionment at the very end, and the fact that he left the group. So it's just trying to find the right little moment. Yeah, because some of the videos are hours and hours long, and the audio tapes are, there's like 100 hours of audio tapes. So you gotta be choosy.
And with the clips that you were just mentioning, we were talking earlier about the SNL sketch that was happening the week following, but even the way that the news covered it, there wasn't very much sensitivity. And in the way that you've compiled those clips, it reads like a criticism of the media and the way that they covered this, the way that they talked about it, but also that larger criticism as a whole of the way that the media very often doesn't think about the people behind stories in the way that it's telling them. Was that part of the intention in having that larger context to the way that you put that footage in there?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that the critique of the media can continue even into today. If you're seeing, just like there's 1992 was sort of like the birth of the 24-hour news networks, and that caused this need to be sort of like content and like infotainment all the time. And it's starting with OJ and Tanya versus Nancy Kerrigan, and that just like Monica Lewinsky, that all blew up. And then you see it going all the way, like there's a lot of discussion right now about the treatment of Britney Spears and that documentary that just came out. You see how the media treated her, and I mean, so it's, I think something that we should be all aware of, like know your source, understand what's the context for any given sort of interaction, and hopefully the media can try to get back to being a little more unbiased. But I don't know how you untangle that web necessarily.
Yeah. And within the series, one of the pieces of footage that you had access to was actually video footage within the building where this mass suicide happened right afterwards, where the bodies are still there. They haven't been moved. They haven't been touched yet. Did you have any conversations about whether you wanted to include that footage at any point? And also what was important to you in the way that you presented that within the series so that it still had an element of sensitivity and didn't feel gratuitous?
Yeah, I mean, we were literally counting how many shots of the dead bodies that we had in the show, because we were trying to see what was too much. I think that there's, when you're dealing with true crime shows or cult shows, and this is sort of a somewhat of a blend, you want to be careful. I worked on a true crime show, and there was tons and tons of crime scene footage. I mean, and crime scene photos. And there's a line that you don't want to cross. And so we were trying to figure out, how do we show the experience of what this member felt like walking into the house and it just being hauntingly quiet and discovering all of these people, but also being being respectful of the fact that these are people's family members. And so we didn't show any faces. We didn't show the just like tons and tons of body bags. I didn't want to show a ton of body parts. I think there's maybe one or two shots of like, you can see the color of somebody's hand, but that's it. We just wanted to be as respectful as we could, but also show just how haunting it was. For me, one of the details that is still hard to understand is that they killed themselves in shifts, and over the course of 3 days. So there was bodies laying in the house, and people would see what it looked like and would continue to move forward.
Yeah. And you also had access to footage that was these exit interviews that they filmed. So they all videoed interviews with each other right before this all occurred. What was even just the emotional experience the first time that you sat down to watch that footage, particularly at that point, having spent a lot of time talking to people, having conversations, learning a lot more about this group, and seeing other footage of them beforehand and who they were up until this point. So having a connection yourself already.
Well, I think what really struck me in those exit interviews is just their happiness. And I think that they don't, you really have to look closely to try to see any sort of defensiveness. And again, in talking to Yanya Lalik, who studied those tapes over and over again for a long time, and she broke it down for us that in and of itself, the way in which that they were put on camera, and that they were mirroring Doe and his mannerisms in a way that I was unaware. Like, that made more sense to me and helped sort of coalesce where the potential manipulation was in just doing these videos. But really, it's just like it's shocking to see their happiness, and the fact that they're so willing to give up their lives. And it really, I think, begs the question of, like, if they're really truly happy, who are we to step in and prevent them from that? It's sort of like the question about, do people have the right to take their own lives? And again, unanswerable question, really. You can try to get beneath the layers and see where they were manipulated and how much that affected their decision-making process. But really, at the end of the day, it's a hard thing to tell.
Yeah. And obviously we were talking just now about the media portrayal and the hope that media can regain a little bit of sensitivity and humanity in some of the stories that they're telling. Do you hope that for audiences as well, that it makes them think a little bit about conversations that they even just have with friends and the way that they respond to certain stories, not even just of this ilk?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of the commentary online. It's just like, the Heaven's Gate shows, man, it's sad. And I'm like, well, yes, it is. I mean, it's. I would rather you feel sad than be laughing at them, which I feel like is kind of what has been shown in the past, or judging them in a way that's completely casting them off and dehumanizing them. So yeah, I think the show sort of operates as a cautionary tale, and I hope that people watch it and discuss the ways in which that, sort of giving up your power to any group or any individual, cutting off your critical thinking process, never ends well. And it doesn't always end in suicide, but it never ends well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this, Clay, and thank you for this conversation.
Of course. Thanks for having me.